Hello, CAPE students. I'm Shanique Francis. This is Economics for Grade 12, and we will be looking into the theory of consumer demand. Let's get right to it. Now, for today's lesson, our objectives include to explain the concept of utility, the law of diminishing marginal utility. We will be looking at explaining equilibrium using the marginal utility approach. We will derive the demand curve using the marginal utility approach, differentiate between different types of goods, and we will look at the demand curve. What is the demand curve, the shifts of the demand curve, as well as the movements along the demand curve. Now, first of all, you would have been introduced in your first lesson for this term to the concept of demand, which is very basic to economics. So demand, generally speaking, can look at desired demand or effective demand. Desired demand is when you want something and you don't necessarily have the means to acquire it. However, there is effective demand, which looks at the willingness and ability of the consumer to obtain goods at various price levels. There is also the concept of market demand. While demand looks at individual consumers, market demand looks at the sum of all individual demand in a market. So it looks at my demand for patties, your demand for patties, your friend's demand for patties. All of our individual demands together will constitute or make up the market demand for patties. Now, the law of demand states that, holding all other things constant, there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. It simply means that when price is moving in one direction, quantity demanded is moving in the opposite direction. Hence the term, inverse or indirect or even negative relationship. So if the price of a good is increasing, generally what happens is that the quantity demanded for that good decreases. So the more expensive something gets, even if it's your favorite food item or your favorite toy, when the price goes up, you tend to purchase less of the good, and that is especially in the case of a normal good. And I'll explain that normal good part a little bit later. Now, the fact that the price can cause the quantity demanded of a good to change, and please remember I said price causes a change in quantity demanded. That is very significant because when we get to the demand curve, we'll notice that price changes cause a movement along the demand curve, but there are other factors that are considered to be non-price factors which have an impact or influence on demand. Now, these factors vary, and you might know more than I'm showing you or than we'll discuss today, but there are several factors that influence demand, and I'll just look at a few. So, one factor which influences a consumer's demand is their income. Think about it. The more lunch money you get to go to school, it means that you can afford to purchase more things at your tuck shop or your canteen. So when your income increases, it puts you in a position to purchase more goods or services. The opposite is also true. When your income decreases, generally speaking, you have the tendency to purchase less goods because you're not as rich or as well off as you were before, so you have to cut back on the things that you are purchasing. And that's just one factor. There are other factors which influence demand, such as changes in the price of related goods. What do we mean by related goods? Now, related goods could be substitutes or complements. And substitutes are goods that are used in place of other goods. So a popular substitute that we might know is butter and margarine. If you usually purchase butter and you realize that the price has been increasing, you'll purchase less butter and more margarine. Or if you usually purchase butter and you realize that margarine is getting very cheap, you switch and say, okay, let me purchase a cheaper good. So the price of that related good could contribute to your change in demand for butter. And then there are complements. Complements are goods that go well together. So when you think about your lunch at school, what two things do you generally purchase together? Are you a patty and cocoa bread person or bun and cheese person? Now, those are examples of complements. So usually if, for example, the price of cocoa bread is increasing and you usually like to have your patty with cocoa bread, but you realize that, okay, cocoa bread is getting too expensive, so you're just not going to buy any more patties. So your demand for patty will decrease based on the fact that the price of the complementary good has changed. There is also another factor which influences demand, which is known as expectations. Now, your expectations today can affect your behavior today. So what if today you expect that the price of bun and cheese will increase tomorrow? Maybe you'll purchase more bun and cheese today so that it will cost you less in the future. You don't have to pay that higher price. And also, you could expect the price of a good to fall. Maybe you're expecting a store to have a Black Friday sale or some other kind of sale. So instead of purchasing the item that you want today, you make a decision to wait until the item goes on sale and then you purchase it. Now, that would cause demand to be lower today because you expect it to change in the future. There are other factors which influence demand, such as taste and preference. You know, there might just be a new trend and you decide to try another good or service, and so that would impact the level of demand. And there's also advertisements which play a very critical role. You see an advertisement for, you know, a new resort on social media, or maybe you get an email and you say, hey, since they're having this deal or since this resort looks so good, let me go and try. Now, without the advertisement, you might not have made that demand, and it's also there for good. So it's not just, you know, that type of service, but maybe you see some sort of food on the TV, looks appealing, you say, hey, let me try it. Maybe if you didn't see the advertisement, you would not have bought it. So I mentioned earlier that demand looks at the willingness and ability to purchase goods at certain prices. And I also referenced the demand curve, which, based on the law of demand, is a downward sloping curve. Now, to construct your demand curve, you will need a demand schedule, which consists of different quantities of goods that are purchased at different price levels. So, in this example, you are seeing my demand schedule. You're seeing the quantities of good which varies, and I'm going to start from the lowest quantity and I'm going to go up. So the quantity demanded ranges from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And the prices in that same order ranges from $40 to $35 to $30 to $25 and also $20. What you're noticing is that as the price increases, the quantity demanded tends to decrease. And at lower prices, more goods are demanded. Now, this is why your demand curve will slope downwards. Notice that when the price of the good is $40, 10 units are demanded, and as the price decreases, the quantities demanded tend to increase. And as I mentioned before, this is generally what happens when you have a normal good. Now, the movement along the demand curve is what you just saw in the graph, right? So when there is a change in price, we are noticing that the quantity demanded, it moves along that same demand curve. There are different points along the curve that consumers will demand based on price changes. So price causes a change in quantity demanded. Remember, price causes a change in quantity demanded. And I'm emphasizing this because there are always some little tricky questions on your exam that ask you about the demand curve and what causes a change in demand. But a change in demand is not caused by a change in price. A change in quantity demanded is caused by a change in price. Demand changes when there is a change in a non-price factor, such as income, the ones I mentioned before. So, again, the change in demand is influenced by a non-price factor. When income changes, when there is a change in the expectation of future prices, and also when you look at the price of related goods, when you consider advertisements, those are things that causes the quantity demanded to change at each price level, and so we say that there is a change in demand. The difference is that the change in price will cause a movement along the demand curve, while a change in a non-price factor, which influences demand, causes the demand curve to shift altogether, such that we have a new demand curve. In this example, you are seeing where the initial demand curve is D and the new demand curve is D1. So we're noticing that the demand curve shifts inwards to the left. Now, what would cause a leftward shift of a demand curve? A leftward shift of a demand curve is caused by any non-price factor which causes demand to be lower at all given prices. So if it means that the consumer earns less income, and so at each price level they are able to afford lower quantities of that good, then that's what happens. The demand curve would shift left. Now, if there are other non-price factors that causes demand to be lower, then this would cause a leftward shift of the demand curve. So since you know what would cause a leftward shift of the demand curve, what would cause a rightward shift of your demand curve? Is it price? Right. So the rightward shift of your demand curve will be caused by also a change in the non-price factor, which causes demand to increase. Now, we're going to look at the types of goods. So I mentioned earlier that there are different types of goods. And in this example, I'm just going to look at three popular types of goods. They are normal goods, inferior goods, and giffen goods. Normal goods, inferior goods, and giffen goods. And if you were listening carefully, you would have heard me mention the normal goods specifically. So what is a normal good in economic sense? Now, when we're talking about a normal good, it's really a good that is described by its relationship between price and income. Let me explain. Now, for a normal good, whenever the price increases, there is a tendency for the quantity demanded to decrease. Hence, the law of demand and the downward sloping demand curve. When price increases, the quantity demanded of that good decreases. Now, there's also a relationship between, the normal good and income. For a normal good, if your income increases, what do you think you have the tendency to do? Once you consider this to be a normal good, if your income does increase, you're going to purchase more of that good. So that's how the normal good works. So remember, for the normal good, price increases, quantity demanded decreases, and when income increases, you purchase more, or if income decreases, you purchase less. Now, there's also the inferior good. When we think of something that is inferior, we're thinking, it's not, inferior is not a good quality, right? Nobody wants to be inferior. No one wants anything inferior. You don't want any inferior experiences. You want the best of the best. So an inferior good then is a good that basically you are consuming it because you don't have a choice. So the inferior good is described by its relationship with income. Now, if I said before that the inferior good is basically one that you use because you don't have a choice, it means then that the consumer who experiences an increase in their income is likely to purchase less of the inferior good. So you used to get $500 for your lunch money. Then your parents say, hey, I'm going to give you $1,000 now. Now that you stop getting a little bit of money, you say, all right, I'm not going to buy this good anymore. Maybe when you used to get the little bit of money, the $500, you used to purchase bun and cheese. But now that you're getting enough money, you're getting $1,000 per day, you decide that, hey, bun and cheese is not going to cut it for me anymore. I need to order some, ackee and saltfish and fried dumpling and barbecue chicken and fried chicken and everything. Because you were only purchasing bun and cheese simply because you didn't have enough money. So for you, that's an inferior good. For someone else, that inferior good could be what you consider to be inferior, could be a normal good, because maybe that's what they'll switch to purchasing when they have more money. Then there's also the giffen good. Giffen good. Now, the giffen good is a special type of inferior good, where when the price increases, that's when people start to purchase more. Usually, a good example of a situation like that is, say, for instance, you have a famine in a region and food is scarce and so prices are high, and people generally purchase, rice, potato, different goods. But they purchase those along with meat. What might be happening is that meat is something that they usually purchase. They normally purchase potatoes too, and I'm using the potatoes as the example of the given good. But the price of meat has gone up and the price of potato also goes up. But the price of meat goes up so much that you decide that instead of, preparing potatoes and meat for dinner or breakfast or whatever meal, you decide that you're just going to purchase more potatoes, because even though the price has increased, the price of the other good you usually purchase has increased so much that you can't afford it either. And so you purchase more potatoes when the price increases. So it's a special type of inferior good. So that was a lot. And let me just break you a little bit so that I can ask some questions. And I want to also tell you to run for your pens, your pencils, your calculators for the next half of the lesson. If you're just joining us, you can do that. All right, so question. Can you explain 2 factors which would cause the demand curve to shift? I think I mentioned about 6 factors. And also, as it relates to the demand curve, what is the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded? All right, so maybe you're answering. Now, if you mention 2 factors which would cause the demand curve to shift and there are non-price factors, if you never say price, you're right. So if you said something like income or advertising or change in taste and preferences, you are correct. Those factors would cause the demand curve to shift. Now, what is the difference between the change in demand and the change in quantity demanded? If you said that the change in demand refers to a shift of the demand curve, then you are also correct. And if you said that the change in quantity demanded means that there has been a change in price and a movement along the demand curve, then you're also correct. So well done. Now, our topic, just to remind you, is the theory of consumer demand. And we know that in economics, they try to make assumptions, they try to understand human behavior, and that's why they refer to economics as a social science. They want to know what causes people to make the decisions that they make. And so they make assumptions, they come up with theories that they use to study behavior and make decisions on a larger scale at the macroeconomic level. Now, one theory that is used in microeconomics is the marginal utility theory. It's also referred to as the cardinalist approach. Now, based on the cardinalist approach, they believe, because I don't believe this, but they believe it, they believe that consumers make their decisions about what to purchase based on the satisfaction that they gain from the good or service. Now, the interesting part of this is how they believe consumers measure the satisfaction, and they believe that consumers assign a numeric value to measure the satisfaction that they get from each good, right? So in making a decision about what good to purchase, the consumers are looking at, which, if you're looking at 2 goods, say you're looking at pineapples and bananas, the consumer is not looking to see, okay, this is bigger than this, let me purchase the pineapples or the bananas. No, the theory says that consumers assign a number, a numeric value in terms of satisfaction to those goods to say, okay, the pineapple will give me, 50 U-tails and the banana will give me 100 U-tails. Since the banana is more satisfying, let me purchase the banana. That's what the theory says. That's not me. Now, we want to look at some key terms before we get into the marginalist or cardinalist theory as it relates to utility. Now, one key term is a rational consumer. And a rational consumer is one who looks at the costs and benefits and disadvantages of consuming additional units of a good. That's what they say a rational consumer is. There is also the concept of total utility. And the utility there is making reference to satisfaction. So total utility looks at the total satisfaction that you get from consuming a good or a service. So the total utility will include all the different satisfactions you get per unit, sum them up, and that will be your total utility. Then there is marginal utility. And marginal is a term that you'll hear more and more as you go on throughout economics. So marginal always looks at what happens when there is a change in terms of one unit. The marginal utility now is the extra satisfaction you get from consuming one more unit of a good. That's marginal utility. And the utils is the imaginary measure of satisfaction. So the marginal utility is based on utils. So for instance, they might say you get 10 utils from consuming a good, and that 10 utils represents the level of satisfaction you would receive from consuming the good. There's the principle of diminishing marginal utility. And again, you'll hear diminishing this and diminishing that in economics more. So diminishing marginal utility now is a theory or a concept which basically says, as you continue to consume more units of a good, each successive unit you consume will give you less satisfaction than the previous unit. So the first time you try a banana in your life, you decide you're gonna try a banana for the first time. It is amazing. Oh my gosh, you've never tasted anything like this. How come I never discovered this fruit before? It's everything for you. And you think to yourself, I want to eat bananas every day. It's so good. But the truth is, as you continue to eat more bananas, you get less and less satisfaction. The experience doesn't feel as great as it did the first time. That's what the theory or the concept of diminishing marginal utility explains. Now, we want to look at what a rational consumer might do. And the rational consumer is one who aims to maximize utility. So I want you to look at this statement and see if you can fill in the blanks. It says, when consumers make choices about the quantity of goods and services to consume, the assumed objective is to maximize total utility, get as much as you can get, right? The consumer faces a number of constraints, the most important of which are the consumer's dash and the dash of the goods and services they wish to consume. I wonder if you are able to fill in those blanks. So think about it. You want to have as much satisfaction as possible, right? And you get the satisfaction from purchasing goods or using services. What are your limitations when you think about, okay, I'm going to buy this today? What do you think about, right? One of the first things you might say is you look at the price. And then you might think, okay, how much money do I have? So the first blank line there, it says the most important of which are the consumer's income, that's the first space, and the price of the goods. So you are restricted in terms of how much you can do because you have a little bit of money, you can't just spend and, infinite sum of money. You are constrained by your income. Another term we want to look at is the consumer equilibrium. And this permits the consumer to get the most satisfaction possible from your income, right? We'll look a little bit more on that. So when we think of a consumer who is purchasing a single good, we say that the consumer, if they're only consuming one good, they are in equilibrium when MU, or marginal utility, derived from the last unit consumed is equal to the price paid by the consumer. So when the MU from the last unit of good you use is equal to the price, you're in equilibrium. Now, what if the consumer is consuming multiple goods? Because we know we don't just consume one good per day. And sometimes, even if you think about what you eat, you want to eat something, you want to have a beverage. Now, when we consider a multiple good framework, the consumer is in equilibrium when the marginal utility for the last dollar they spend on one good or the first good, the marginal utility, the ratio of marginal utility to price based on the last dollar spent on one good or the first good is also equal to the ratio of the marginal utility to price of the second good. So the marginal utility in this example of good X divided by good X should be equal to the marginal utility of good Y divided by the price of good Y. What does that mean? It simply means the consumer will consume both goods to a point where they are indifferent. They get the same level of satisfaction from both. Now we want to look at this table, which is showing you total utility and marginal utility. And we are saying that the goods that we're focusing on are snow mints. And in the table, it has 3 columns and several rows. That's about 2, 4, 6, 8. It's 8 rows. So the first, we're looking at the number of snow mints. So it goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the total utilities related to those different numbers I mentioned are 0, 7, 11, 13, 14, 14, and then 13. The marginal utility, the first space is blank because you get no utility if you consume nothing. And then it's 7, 4, 2, 1, 0, and negative 1. What we're seeing in this table is that as the consumer consumes more of the good, the total utility is increasing. And we notice that the marginal utility is decreasing. Now, the marginal utility decreases because of the law of diminishing marginal utility. As you consume more snow mints, you get less satisfaction from each successive unit. However, we notice that the total utility increases up to a point. The total utility will decrease when the marginal utility becomes negative. How does this work? How do you get negative satisfaction? If you're consuming a good and as you continue to consume more units of the good, you get less and less satisfaction. You can consume the good up to a point where you're sick of the good, you're disgusted, it's like, I don't even want this. So you reach a point where you're dissatisfied, and that's where the negative marginal utility comes in. So because the marginal utility decreases as you consume additional units, you'll notice that the total utility increases, yes, up to a point, and as it increases, it's increasing at a decreasing rate. At first, it moves from 7 to 11, then from 11 to 13. We notice the gap gets smaller and smaller each time until it starts to decrease when the marginal utility becomes negative. Now, if you should use the data that was just showed to you to plot your total utility curve and your marginal utility curve, this is what it would look like. You'll notice the total utility curve increases sharply initially. That's when the marginal utility is at its highest. And then the curve gets a little flat because marginal utility, the law of diminishing marginal utility sets in, and MU is decreasing. And then we notice the total utility curve dips, and that's what happens when MU becomes negative. Now, this is one of the conditions we mentioned earlier about the consumer maximizing utility. And there are 2 conditions for utility maximization. The first one, this one I mentioned earlier, it's also referred to the equimarginal principle. And it's where the marginal utility divided by the price of one good is equal to the marginal utility divided by the price of the other good. And I did say earlier that what it means is that the consumer, when making the decision between 2 goods to make a purchase, they're going to consume the good to a point in which they are indifferent. So initially, if you have 2 goods, the consumer is going to purchase the good. Their first purchase will be the good that gives them more satisfaction. Now, because there is a law of diminishing marginal utility, if you focus on purchasing one good, eventually you'll get less and less satisfaction. When the satisfaction of that good that you prefer starts to decline, you'll notice that the other good, because you haven't purchased any units of it, it will have a higher level of marginal utility or satisfaction, and so you'll make the decision to start purchasing the other good. So eventually you get to a point where you're indifferent. It doesn't matter which good you're purchasing because the satisfaction gained from both will eventually be equal. Now, if you think about it, what I just said, to prove that this condition is real, as I mentioned, if you are purchasing apples and bananas, you have the option to purchase two goods, right? Initially, you start to purchase the apples because, okay, apples are more satisfying. You have a higher level of utils. Eventually, you get to a point where the utils for apples start to fall. And so you switch to purchasing bananas. And then when you switch to purchasing bananas, the marginal utility for that will start to fall also. And eventually, you get to a point where you are indifferent between the two. It doesn't matter which of the two you purchase. Now, there is another condition for utility maximization, and this is that the consumer must spend all of their income. This means that the price times quantity of one good plus the price times the quantity of the other good should be equal to I, or income. Now, if the consumer has money left over when they have purchased, a certain quantity of both goods, it means that the price times quantity of one good plus the price times quantity of the other good is less than income. And that means that the consumer is not being rational. They're not maximizing their satisfaction. And to maximize satisfaction, you must consume both goods until you're indifferent. That's one condition. And also, you must spend all of your income. If you have more money, how can you be fully satisfied? When you have more money, it's a signal, it's a suggestion. It means that you are able to purchase more goods and get more satisfaction. So these are the two conditions of utility maximization. Now, this is where you need your pen, your pencil, a calculator, a marker, a crayon, whatever you use to write, right? And also your critical thinking skills. We want to look at the example where a consumer is choosing between two goods and there are different levels of marginal utility. Now, in this table, there are quantities of the first good. We'll call the first good A. And we have 4 columns where we're looking at the quantities and marginal utilities for both goods. For good A, we have the first, second, third, and fourth units. That's in the first column. In the second column, we have the marginal utility of good A, which is 7, 5, 3, and 1. In the third column, we have the second good, which is good B, and we have the quantities being the first, second, third, and fourth. Now, I just showed you a table looking at the marginal utilities of two goods. And what I want you to look at is quickly how I will show you the pattern of spending for the consumer. Now, based on this question, it says that the consumer has the option of purchasing two goods. Each good costs $1 each. And you want to know the combinations that the consumer will choose based on the satisfaction. Now, looking at this table, the consumer's choice will be first to purchase the first unit of good B because it has greater utils than the first unit of good A. The consumer's budget is $5, by the way. So the consumer purchases good B, and then they're going to compare the first unit of good A and good B. The second largest utils is good A. So the consumer will purchase A, then B again, then both A and B simultaneously because the utils is the same for both goods. I want you for your assignment now to calculate the total utils based on those goods and also to see if the consumer was maximizing their income. I also want to mention that when you have a situation where the prices are different, you will look at the marginal utility per dollar of both goods. In this example, you're seeing two goods. The price of one good is $2 and the price of the other good is $4, and you have the marginal utility. Your first step will be to calculate the marginal utility per dollar and then make the comparison. Now, we've done quite a bit today and we want to recap very quickly, and I hope you were paying attention. So I have a few questions for you. And I will not give you the answers to all of the questions because I want you to find some on your own. So I'll be moving through some of the questions. The first question is which best expresses the law of diminishing marginal utility. And if you scan through the responses, I would say that which is the best one, right? Look at that. I'll give you an answer for one of them. The second question says the total utility of a product is calculated by, and the response there is the third one. and it is the summing of the marginal utilities for each successive units. And I gave away this answer already. This is another question for you to look at. Which situation is consistent with the law of diminishing marginal return? Have you figured it out as yet? I hope you're writing these down. So that's all we have time for today on the theory of consumer demand. It was my pleasure being here.